Welcome, everyone. We're gonna wait for everyone to join the Zoom, but as we're waiting, welcome. We're glad you're all here. Happy December. Hard to believe it's almost the end of the year. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving and are gearing up for the holidays. And again, like I said, welcome if you're just joining. We will get started in just a moment here once we have everyone joined. And if you have, throughout the program, if you have any technical difficulties, please send a message in the chat box and we will do our best to help troubleshoot your issues. But hopefully you won't have any and it'll be an enjoyable program for everyone. Good morning. For those who are just joining, we are waiting for everyone to hop on to the Zoom, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome everyone to the December 2021 Curator conversation here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. This is a VMHC member only program. So welcome members. And as always, thank you so much for your continued support of the museum. As I'm sure you've heard through mail and email lately, we've got a lot going on. We are very hard at work finishing up construction at the museum and gearing up for our grand reopening in May of next year. So stay tuned for lots more info and excitement around the reopening schedule. We are so excited to share the new building with you. As part of that reopening, we are of course very busy with our curatorial team gearing up to create and present over, I think we have 7, new exhibitions or updated exhibitions and galleries that will be part of our reopening. So as part of that, our curators, we've got all of them today, are going to take you through some new acquisitions we've received to the collection in the last year. So I'm very excited to learn about that myself. And before I turn it over, I did want to introduce, we have, like I said, all of our curators here today. We have Andy Talkoff, who is our Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs. We have Dr. William Rasmussen, who is the Senior Curator, and Laura M. Robbins, Curator of Art. And then we are also joined by VMHC curators, Brittany Hutchinson, Paige Newman, and Dr. Karen Sherry. As I said at the beginning, if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to add them in the chat. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to add those in the chat or the Q&A feature. We will have time at the end for some Q&A. So again, welcome. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Andy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone. Happy holidays. I think that it's particularly fitting that at this time of the year, when you're all thinking about gifts, we are going to take some time and talk about some things that have been gifted to us in 2021 to be added to the collection of your Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Every year, the museum adds hundreds of books and manuscript collections, maps, diaries, periodicals, and objects to the collection. And that can actually total thousands, sometimes like tens of thousands of individual pieces. So the collection grows extensively every year. A lot of these things are offered to us by members of the public and our own members who want to ensure that the stories that are embodied in these collections are able to be preserved and add to our understanding of the past, or even so that future people can have a better understanding of the present and the times in which we live. So our curators have been not only receiving offers from all of you and the public, but also have actively been building the collection. And in the 190 years that we've been collecting, we've amassed about 9 million objects. There are some gaps in the collection that we recognize and are trying to correct as parts of major initiatives. And as you might suspect, these are collections that are associated with indigenous peoples of Virginia, immigrant communities that have become part of Virginia's story over the last, say, 75 years, communities of color. And so we're actively trying to build a collection that is most representative of the history of our Commonwealth. So last year, our curatorial team decided to take a look back and share some of the stories of recent additions to the collections. And we had such a good time doing that we thought we would do it again. And I think we will probably do it again next year. So I think you're part of the second annual version of this program. So I'm really pleased to be able to be joined by all of my colleagues on the curatorial team. And I'm very excited about the stories we have to tell today. So I'm going to pass the program off to Dr. William Rasmussen, who's going to talk to us about a really wonderful collection of illustrations. Bill, take it away.
I'm going to take it away, Andy. I was unmuting myself. Well, as you see, well, you don't see it yet, but what I'm going to talk about is a gift of 100 sketches of Virginia. Actually, they're part of an even larger group of 800 sketches that include other parts of the country and even Europe. They were given to us by a friend of ours who lives in Powhatan, and his great-grandfather was from New England. He was Harvard educated. He was a very successful businessman, and he was an amateur artist. He just had a God-given talent. And he spent a lot of time in Virginia 100 years ago. All these drawings date from about 1900 to 1941. And what's particularly interesting about these is some of the buildings may be gone today. No one studied these. I have a couple of images at the start that I'm particularly intrigued by. If we can look at the next image, it's unfortunately the man's name was Henry Merlin Williams. He labeled them, so we know what it is. These are the old slave quarters of the Meriwether Lewis homestead. This is Lewis of Lewis and Clark, and he didn't stay there, but this is his parents' homestead. And whether or not that's there or not, no one's had time to study these to find out. Another one that's particularly interesting is a little schoolhouse from 1938 in Wellborn, Virginia. And whether that's there or not, we don't know yet. So there are a lot of discoveries that are to be had with these. But let me give you the context of this. This period of 100 years ago, there was a great rediscovery of the landscape. Now, this artist spent most of his time, most of his efforts drawing pictures of houses, but occasionally he would show some landscape. The next one shows what everybody depicted when they went to Virginia. But I want to read you a quote from Teddy Roosevelt in 1907. He started this rediscovery of the land. He said, "Do not let selfish men or greedy interests skim your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance. The world in the future and our very citizens and our very children shall judge you according how you deal with this sacred trust." The landscape was being destroyed by coal miners and oil drillers and so on, and that was what the gist. That's where Teddy Roosevelt's coming from. And this man Henry Moreland Williams is not going around looking at the wilderness land, but he's part of this movement. And it's very interesting. At the same time he's drawing this, the Garden Club of Virginia was founded in the late 1920s, and they started their garden weeks every year in the late 20s. And on those garden week tours, you would go drive around the countryside, and you would stop and look. You'd see a lot of landscape as you're driving around. You would stop and look at interesting places. And that's essentially what Henry Moreland Williams was doing. So here we see here you see a drawing of the Unitarian Church in Lynchburg, 1920. The Garrett House in Williamsburg. And it's interesting to look at what he doesn't depict. He doesn't go into the cities and show you modern buildings. He goes, if he goes into a city, it's a town like Williamsburg or Yorktown, and he draws interesting houses, because one of the beauties of Virginia, in addition to its land, is its early architecture. And apparently 100 years ago, you could plop down in somebody's front yard and draw their house and not be driven away. There must be some interesting stories that are waiting to be found. He tells us this is the Diggs house in Yorktown in 1940. So he's going all over the state, visiting them many times. This is the Horseshoe, he tells us, in 1938 at Rapidan. Very classical building, and so typically early Virginia architecture. What's interesting about this man's style is he has a lot of detail where he wants to put it, but he doesn't overburden the drawing with detail. If he gave us detail everywhere, it wouldn't work. So this man just instinctively knew how to draw. This is obviously, he didn't identify it, but it's obviously a copy of Mount Vernon. And you can see on the outside a number of changes from Mount Vernon, particularly that addition that curves on the right. And no doubt there are many changes on the inside from Mount Vernon. So I don't know what this house is, but it's an interesting one to discover and to determine whether or not it's still standing. And one last one, this is York Hall at Yorktown. So he focuses here and gives us all sorts of interesting detail and a wonderful early Georgian doorway right there. So we are intrigued with this collection for a number of reasons, and it's sort of typical of sort of what Andy was overviewing at the beginning. We never know what's out there and what's going to come in, and so we're continually surprised and continually delighted by the surprises. I will turn it over at this point to my colleague Paige Newman.
Thank you, Bill. So I'm going to talk about Peter Bridges' diaries. I have them with me, the real life. We have 2 record books, and Peter Scott Bridges, he was, though he was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, and raised in Illinois, Bridges' family roots in Gloucester County, Virginia, go deep. He attended Dartmouth College and Columbia University before serving 2 years in the U.S. Army and stationed in France. He joined the Foreign Service in 1957 and served until his retirement in 1986. In addition to several administrative positions, including serving as director of the State Department's Office of Performance Evaluation, he served overseas in Panama, Moscow, Prague, and twice in Rome. So hopefully I piqued your interest a little bit, because I did not reveal exactly what these diaries are about. But Peter Bridges served as the American ambassador to Somalia in 1984 to 1986. So yes, next slide, please. So here are the record books that we received, 2 of them. And I want to, if you'll go to the next slide. Thank you. This is the sort of what's written on the front page of the cover, well, inside the cover. And what I'm going to do is read Bridges' first entry, dated, you can't really see it because it's not, but it's dated Wednesday, November 21st, 1984. And Bridges is currently in Rome. And he writes, "Today is gray and cold. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving Day. And on this coming Sunday, I fly to New York and then Washington for 2 weeks consultations about Somalia, toward the end of which I am to be sworn in as ambassador to Somalia. Within a month from now, if my plan holds, I will have presented my credentials to President Siad Barre. And Siad Barre, he was the president of Somalia from 1969 to 1991. And we'll be back in Rome for Christmas and New Year's with my family before returning to Mogadishu to settle in finally, or at least for a couple years in my new mission. So Bridges was appointed ambassador by President Ronald Reagan as a recess appointment, not to avoid Senate confirmation, but because the post was vacant. The Senate was in recess, and the president of Somalia was complaining that the continuing vacancy showed Washington's lack of concern for his country. Bridges served 6 months in the recess appointment, then came back to Washington for Senate hearings. He received a unanimously favorable vote from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But then Senator Jesse Helms put a hold on his and other nominations because Helms claimed the Reagan administration had not appointed enough conservatives to State Department jobs. This really didn't affect Bridges because he had already gone back to Mogadishu, and once approved by the Senate, he took his oath of office on the roof terrace of his house overlooking the Indian Ocean. So next slide, please. So here are a couple materials. The donation I'm talking about right now are the 2 record books that you saw in the first slide. Bridges had previously donated materials concerning as ambassador and other parts of his previous positions in 2016. And I wanted to use some of these items just to visualize his job. And you see there's a memo, and it's President Reagan appointing Bridges to be an ambassador to Somalia. And I just thought it would be nice to visualize what he looked like at the time too. So can we go to the next slide? Here are his weekly, like a week schedule and his weekend schedule. And it's for the second week of January of 1985. He has meetings with fellow ambassadors from Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, Iraq, France, and Saudi Arabia. So he's a pretty busy guy. What I've read, and his hours, I think, were 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. But clearly, the world doesn't stop. So I guess he didn't stop either. So next slide, please. So here is just an image of Bridges. There's many projects. Because of the time limit, I didn't want to go really into big detail. But an image of Bridges, it's one of the port rehabilitation projects. And then a letter dated April 29th, 1986, mentioning his retirement. So he spent a year in Somalia, then retired from government service. In retirement, he's worked for the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, Shell Oil Company, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, among others. He is the author of several books and articles about his foreign service experiences, as well as on literary and historical topics. Next slide. So you see the front is a book he's written. I don't know how to pronounce the title, but I know it does mean ambassador. I just didn't want to butcher saying it. And I'm also going to read part. This is the last page of the first diary. And I don't know if you probably can read along with me, but I just thought this gives a nice kind of understanding. You get a really great idea of who Bridges is as a human, but also how he considers his job and his position. So it starts out, final note. A critic may complain that this book does not tell as much as it might. It says nothing about any CIA activities in Somalia. It does not reveal any secret Pentagon views about Somalia's place in our strategy. It does not even give a detailed account of all our embassy in Somalia was involved in. all the aid projects, the many military assistant teams, the political and economic reporting, the consular problems, and all the administrative ones. Nor does it give any clues to the identity of Somalis who talk to me frankly of the repugnant regime. I did not mean to write a comprehensive book. I wanted to leave a record of how it felt to be an American ambassador in a poor and distant country for a little space of time. I wanted to leave this for my children because my father, whom I love very much and who traveled to so many countries, had never done this for me. It is not much to be an ambassador, but it is important for any man to leave behind him what record he can of his life and experience if he thinks this can be useful to those who come after him. And if this wasn't useful, I hope it was entertaining. So that's just a little peek of part of this collection. So I'm going to now hand it over to my colleague, Karen Sherry.
Thanks, Paige, and good morning, everyone. I am going to talk to you about one of the more interesting objects I shepherded it into the collection this year. Could I have the next slide, please, Andy? It is this small quilt square. Came to us from a woman in South Carolina who contacted us to make this donation because there's an explicitly Virginia reference in this quilt square, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is a quilt square that is done in the crazy quilt style. And that style just means that pieces of fabric are quilted together in a random pattern. Each block takes on its own unique style. And then the blocks are all pieced together. So it's not like some more traditional quilts which follow a standard pattern in each block. Crazy quilt patterns are often distinguished by the use of very colorful and varying stitches to piece together the different scraps of cloth, and you can see that in this example. Now, one thing that, as I mentioned, gives this a decidedly Virginia significance is an embossed ribbon that is stitched into the center of this quilt square, and it reads "Peace, Law, and Order, Equal Rights, Lodge Number 7, APA, Virginia." I'm going to talk a little bit more about what APA means in a moment, but if we could move to the next slide, please. Now, the VMHC has a lot of quilts in our collection. It's an art form that is well represented in our collection, including many examples of crazy quilts, two of which you can see here on the screen. So we generally don't take quilts into the collection simply because we already have so many. But this APA quilt square is unique enough that it merited collecting. Now, I pointed out that APA ribbon in the center of the quilt. Quilt makers often personalize their quilts in some way. In the crazy quilt on the left of your screen, Nanny White, the maker, embroidered various monograms into the quilt. In the crazy quilt on the right side of the screen, the quilt maker stitched in a printed fabric piece showing a Japanese ukiyo-e style print. Could I have the next slide, please? And what makes the APA quilt square so distinctive is, as I mentioned, this ribbon. And so when I received the notice from the donor wanting to give us this quilt square, I started researching what the APA could be. And it could be one of two secret societies from the 19th century, either the American Protestant Association, which was founded in the 1840s. It seemed to have petered off by the late 19th century, the 1890s, when this quilt square was made, but it does seem that some chapters were still active. The second organization that the APA could stand for is the American Protective Association, which was founded in 1887. It was very active through about 1896 and then really petered off in its activities until 1911 when the organization was kaput. What makes it kind of difficult to know exactly which organization this ribbon refers to is the fact that both of these were secret societies. So members generally didn't identify themselves outside the group. The group often didn't leave records, weren't reported in the newspapers and so forth. So that's why there's a little ambiguity about what the APA could stand for in this quilt square. Could I have the next slide, please? But I do think it refers to the American Protestant Association based on a menu that one of my colleagues in education, Haley Fenner, helped find. This is a menu that was printed for a reception that a Philadelphia chapter of the American Protestant Association was having. And I'm showing the cover and one of the interior pages. And at the bottom of the interior page, there's a little inscription that reads, motto of the American Protestant Association, peace, law, and order. And since those exact words are printed on the label of our quilt square, that's why I think this particular square relates to the American Protestant Association. That said, it's not definitive because there is some suggestion that the two organizations may have merged. Certain chapters or lodges of the American Protective Association absorb the earlier American Protestant Association. So we don't know for sure, but nevertheless, if I can have the next slide, please. I don't want to say it doesn't make a difference, not knowing exactly which organization it is, but the two organizations were very similar in their purpose. They were both founded as nativist, anti-immigration, particularly anti-Catholic societies. And as I mentioned, the American Protestant Association from the 1840s, the American Protective Association, which was founded in the 1880s, both of those organizations, which were founded as secret societies, were established in response to contemporary patterns of immigration. In the middle of the 19th century, tens of thousands of immigrants from Ireland and Germany were coming to the US. The Irish immigrants were escaping the Great Potato Famine. The German immigrants were escaping political unrest in Germany. And this huge influx of immigrants in the mid-19th century concerned a lot of Americans who felt that their Anglo-Saxon Protestant way of life was being threatened by these newcomers. And you get a sense of the vitriol of that anti-immigration sentiment and some of their fears, their paranoia in the cartoon on the left side, which shows a caricature of an Irish man who's wearing a whiskey barrel, suggesting that he's a drunkard, next to a German immigrant who's identified by his barrel, marked lager beer. And the two of them are making off with a ballot box. So secret societies and nativist groups like the American Protestant Association were stirring up paranoia that these new immigrants were going to take over political power and advance an agenda that these anti-immigrant groups were afraid of. The similar sentiments spurred the development of the American Protective Association, founded in the late 1880s, and that APA became the largest anti-immigrant group of the 19th century. And in that period, the APA was responding to a huge wave of millions of immigrants who were coming to this country from Southern Europe and Southeastern Europe, places like Italy and Poland and so on. And a cartoon from that period shows kind of analogous anti-immigrant sympathies, where we see Uncle Sam buffered against the rocks as waves of immigrants called riffraff immigration wash along America's shores. And it's a little hard to see, but if you look at the hats and scarves worn by the immigrants in the water, they're labeled with things like criminal, disease, and so forth. What's really kind of interesting about a lot of this anti-immigration sentiment is we see echoes of it in present day anti-immigration and nativist sentiments as those groups demonize people coming from other parts of the world. So if we could go to the final slide, please. This is a quilt square that very much speaks to those moments of anti-immigration history in our country. It's a disturbing history. It's a sort of ugly history, but nevertheless, it's part of our national story and also our Virginia story. There was clearly a Virginia chapter of the APA here in Virginia, as noted by this ribbon, which identifies it as Lodge number 7. I haven't been able to find any specific information about that lodge yet, but hopefully with additional research, we'll be able to identify that. And what makes this quilt square, I think, particularly fascinating, not just in the way it reflects broader anti-immigration sentiments in American culture, but the fact that it embeds this kind of political message into what is a distinctly female form of artistic expression. Quilts in this period were pretty much exclusively made by women. Here we see a very rare example of a woman incorporating a political message into her quilt. It's also, this quilt square is very unique because we have very few records on either one of the APA groups and very few material records, artifacts like this quilt square. So I hope you enjoyed that story about one of our new acquisitions. And for our next featured object, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Telkoff.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I'm not sure whether the title of this section is misleading or not, but it became obvious as I was getting ready to talk about this collection and going through it that it was wholly appropriate. So I'll leave you with that for a minute and tell you that we were contacted earlier this year by a donor who was very much focused on the items that his family had kept related to the World War I service of his grandfather, Herman Henry Shute, who you can see here in a photograph in August 1919. The collection included a number of other photographs, the uniform, jacket, and trousers that he's wearing in both of these images, his unit photograph, which many of you might, from the World War I period, many of you might have seen these. They're long and rectangular, maybe 3 feet long, with lots of images of little men, lined up in some formation. Those were offered as souvenirs to soldiers. A framed portrait, and the piece that was a little bit of a mystery was 122 letters that accompanied the collection, which I assumed would largely talk about his career in the U.S. Army during World War I. So a little bit about Herman Shute. He was born in 1897 in Cecil, Wisconsin. And when he was 7 years old, his father and mother moved the family to Burkeville, Virginia, where they largely made their living by farming. And at some point between the time he was 7 and 1917, when he was about 20, he met a young woman named Addie Chandler, and they began a correspondence that lasted from 1917 until 1923. This is the first, almost every single one of them has an envelope. They were clearly collected by Addie over the course of a number of years. I'm not sure whether the 122 letters represent every single letter he ever sent to her over this period. I suspect there may be maybe some missing, but she was fairly diligent about it. So this letter is dated Burkeville, Virginia, November 4th, 1917. A couple of things about this particular letter. He addresses it, "My dearest friend," which to me suggests that this is, fairly early in the relationship that they have. And he writes, "I thought I would sit down and let you know that I am still living, and I hope the same from you," which is included in almost every one of the letters that I read, is this particular greeting, which is very common. I mean, even going back, into the earlier century, letters among family and friends oftentimes referenced people's health and how they were doing. When he's not feeling well, he says he's not feeling well. This is a major subject because, this is something that's of concern to everybody. On the next page, you'll see at the bottom left part, left-hand side of the note, he says that we're going to have a fair at the hall Thursday the 8th, and he would like, asks her if she wants to go, and that he should let her know right away. There are a lot of events like this referenced in his letters to her that were occurring locally. He also makes some reference to a fellow named Thompson in this letter. I'm not sure if this was a friend of theirs and he was joking with her about him having to go alone if Thompson was going to be at this event, because maybe Addie had her eyes set on him for a little bit, or if it was just a joke. I mean, one of the things that becomes apparent as you read through these is that he has quite an interesting, quite a good sense of humor, and is like a professional flirter, just filled with lots of flirtations. Nothing like dirty in any way, but they're all very appropriate flirtations for the time. But he's clearly very interested in her. And then he signs off at the bottom right. He says, "Be good, from your old friend, Herman Shute, Jr." Now, he signs it "Bye Bye Love." And the first time I saw the initials SWAK, I was uncertain what that acronym could possibly mean. And then it became clearly apparent that it meant sealed with a kiss, right? And in fact, in another note, a few notes, he actually hides messages inside the envelope and will write things like, "I'll bet you a kiss if you see this," right? So it's a very sweet, not what I was quite expecting necessarily in letters that were coming in with a collection that was largely focused on World War I. Now, the US does enter the First World War on April 6, 1917. Shute is rather late to enlistment, and enters the Army on September 6, 1918. And he's sent to Camp Lee near Petersburg for training. Here's an image that may be similar to the experience he had when he was arriving at Camp Lee. This is a photo of new recruits arriving at the camp during its construction. And also here's another view of the construction of the camp. They started building it in June of 1917, and in a little over 3 months, there were 1,500 buildings and 15 miles of road. And this is a steamroller essentially, making a road. The roads would be really important to Herman because he was assigned to the Motor Transport Corps. So His unit was the 155th Depot Brigade, 8th Battalion, 30th Company. Here he is next to an automobile. And I think that what's really interesting about this is that, you know, his experience in the military was with new technology, right? Relatively new technology. World War I is the first war that would become largely mechanized. And so he was preparing to participate in transportation of troops and men and supplies. So his first letter from Camp Lee is written on YMCA stationery, as are most of the letters that he writes during his time in the Army. I like the little pitch at the bottom left that says, you know, save food, buy Liberty bonds and war saving stamps, right? So, and, you know, support the war effort by saving paper by writing on both sides is one of the messages. Now, you know, in this letter, dated September 12th, 1918, he immediately talks about the fact that he may be sent overseas and that he's enthusiastic about it. So don't let it surprise you none if you hear I'm gone over there. I have got that in my head that the sooner, the more tickled I am. And in this same letter, he mentions something at the very top of the right-hand page. He says, I'll be waiting for you by the kitchen door. Did you get that little remembrance I sent? And in and among this collection of items that came in is this pouch, which I have here with me. So you can see roughly how large it is. It says, remember me, under hand embroidered shield and flags of the United States. And then when you open the pouch, there's a pocket made from a 48-star US flag. I've seen a few other examples of these online that have come up for auction over the years. They all seem to have the Remember Me logo, and it seems to be that this letter refers to this particular token that he would have obtained at camp and sent back to her. So it's really great to have a reference to a physical object in the letter that he saved. Now the war ends on November 11th, 1918. Herman had been in the Army for a grand total of 68 days. So his wartime service was cut fairly short. This is the first existing letter that was sent to Addie after the war, November 16th, 1918. He's still in the military. I was surprised that either there's a letter missing or he didn't seem that it was important to mention the end of the war in his letter. But what he does mention is how close he actually came to getting shipped overseas. So he said that they had left Camp Lee a week ago that night, and that he's glad that they left. And we were taken to City Point, and there we got on a boat on the big vessel Susquehanna. After we sailed 5 hours, the captain received a wireless to return. So I think this is really interesting in that, you know, we all know that the war ended on November 11th, but of course the military was in full motion trying to send as many men and material to the war effort. And then it suddenly is put on hold. So Herman never makes it out of Virginia as part of his wartime service. In the next letter, he remained in the Army, I should say, until August 1919. Most of the letters in the collection are written after the war and really document the relationship between Herman and Addie. So for most of 1920 and 1921, Addie was actually living in Richmond, working as an operator in a cigar factory here and living in a boarding house with a number of other women, young women in their 20s who were working in the tobacco industry. I wanted to see what he said 100 years ago today, what the news was, but the closest I could come was this letter from December 7th, in which he writes that, sort of humorously said, "I got your letter yesterday and was glad to hear from you so soon, haha." So we're not the only ones who, insert haha, right? LOL, the equivalent in their letters. He does this a lot too. You can see there's a tee-hee at the end of this as well, but clearly she maybe didn't write as often as he wanted her to. He said, "That's all right, late's better than never. So you say you're gonna have a few words with me when you see me, well, I expect to talk a little myself," right? So, and here you'll notice that there's a shift. He signs his name here, Herman, right? So clearly their relationship has been progressing over the years. They continued to write until May 3rd, 1923. The last letter in the collection is dated from Burkeville. He talks about how much he misses her, that it's been a very long week, that he's trying to coordinate supper with his mother and some other guests, including his best man and his best man's wife. But what I think is really endearing here is that he says that he's getting ready for Monday. And he says, "So be good until Monday. I'm not yet what I'm going to be, haha." And this is the last letter that he writes before they're married 4 days later on May 7th, and the letters end. So, so this is the end of 122 letters that Herman had written to Addie. I think there are great, so aside from the World War I content, which is interesting, what's really wonderful is that the majority of these letters are not only between the him and his future wife, but really speak to what everyday life in Burkeville was like. I mean, that's what he's reporting to her primarily. So in the early 1940s, he and Addie moved to Colonial Heights. He bought into Marathon Oil Service in Petersburg, which he ultimately owned with his son and another fellow, Charles Martin. Herman died in 1978, and Addie followed him in 1984. And all I can say is that this is really a remarkable collection that will be very useful to future historians for study. And I really have James S. Shute and his mother, Mrs. Iris Shute, to thank for sharing this collection. And if anyone happens to come across Addie's letters back, we would absolutely love to see them, because I'm sure the other part of the conversation was fascinating as well. So now I'm going to pass off the program to my colleague, Brittany Hutchinson.
Thank you so much, Andy. I'm tickled by the tee-hee at the end of one of those letters. So today I'll be talking about a donation from Mr. I.B. Dent from Farmville, Virginia. And the title for this section is Caroline and Lily White, which are the names of the fascinating folks I'm talking about. So Andy, next slide, please. So we got this donation in, which includes quite remarkably some images of this lovely woman here whose name was Caroline White, who was born as an enslaved person in Wythe County, Virginia in 1848. And she lived to be about 103 years old. We have her date for passing is 1951. So Caroline was formerly enslaved by the Dent family. And at some point in the sort of later years toward the turn of the century, she left and returned to the family, I believe. We don't have the exact dates for when she did, but upon returning to the family, to the donor's family, she, quote, said that she is here to raise the children. And so this is a story really that doesn't have very much of manuscript and written material, which is very common for African-American history, but the material culture that we do have as part of this collection is something that opens up the opportunity for some great research that we hope to do, and we hope that other scholars can engage with as well. So a little bit more about sort of the Caroline White story with the Dent family. As I mentioned, she was born enslaved and later employed by the donor's great-great-grandparents. And she went on to raise 3 generations of Dent children, most notably the donor's grandfather, who was Charles Lee Dent. This is when she returned to the Dent family to work as a domestic in the 1899, I believe was the date that she returned. So can we go ahead and to the next slide, please? So this is a rocking chair that was used and was designated as Caroline's chair. She was called Aunt Caroline by everyone in the family. And this chair is something that is more utilitarian rather than decorative. As you can see, it has no arms, and this is known as a nursing chair. So this is for the purpose of rocking children, sometimes multiple children, nursing and caring for young people. And this is a pine chair that was owned by Aunt Caroline, as she was called. And the donor recalls sort of visiting the family in the 1940s, her grandparents in the 1940s, and going to sit on Aunt Caroline's lap. And his mother and grandmother would always tell him, you know, don't hurt Aunt Caroline. That was the sort of main rule that he had as a young child, was very careful with Aunt Caroline, because of course at this time she was close to 90 years old. And one thing that he also mentioned when sort of retelling the story of Aunt Caroline's sort of legacy with his family was that there was a hierarchy wherein his grandparents were first, and then Aunt Caroline was next, then his parents. So he was meant to obey folks in that particular order, which sort of speaks to the place that she had within this family. After she reached a certain age and no longer worked for the family, they did provide housing for her nearby, for her and her daughter Lily. And so this sort of rocking chair, the research that we could use to engage through this particular object would be to understand the ways in which African-American women, formerly enslaved women, and enslaved women were parts of the sort of maternal structure within a particular family, and how their role as caretakers evolved over time. This chair, being that belonged to Aunt Caroline or Caroline White, is something that is quite unique for us because it's an object that speaks directly to the agency and the individuality of a formerly enslaved person, as opposed to having a different object to sort of define her life and what her role was within the family. Go to the next slide for me, please. So these are 2 tools that Aunt Caroline used. Now, we tend to think that I guess the record would show that for the most part, domestic work and sort of unskilled, quote unquote, labor was something that's what enslaved women typically did and performed. But as you can see, these are tools, obviously, and I believe the one on the left is one that's used for shoemaking, I want to say. And so these 2 objects really speak to the different types of labor that enslaved women would perform. On larger plantations, it was very common to have a very sort of finite role where you stuck to that particular, you know, type of labor. But on a smaller farm, such as the one for the Dent family, your responsibilities could include highly skilled labor. It could include more domestic work. It could include something that would not be typically considered as something that enslaved people would perform because of the small stature and small size of those types of farms. And so Caroline White was someone who obviously helped raise children, but she also did skilled labor as part of this sort of family structure in Wythe County. And so we can go to the next slide quickly. So this is an interesting part of this collection. This was actually Lily's prized possession, was her toy. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have very much sort of written material that speaks to what Caroline White's or Lily White's lives were like. And that's something that takes additional research. It's quite difficult to perform, and we're really excited about the opportunity to engage in that research. But this particular object opens up the opportunity for us to discuss how young children of formerly enslaved people, how they sort of interacted with each other, interacted with children who were maybe not the same race, and what their recreational activities were like. And having this toy, having this object, it's quite adorable and belonged to Lily, is something that we're hoping to sort of have a discussion about what play was like for her. She did work for the family after her mother passed away, and she lived on to about 1967. And the first picture we saw at the very beginning of my presentation was from 1938 for Miss Caroline's 90th birthday, I'm sorry. So I'm going pretty quickly because I know we're running out of time. So I want to get to our question and answers really quickly. But so I'm really excited about this collection and this donation because we have a few different opportunities for research that could really help us understand what their experiences were like, what the African-American, formerly enslaved and recently emancipated experience was like in Virginia in particular. And it's a quite enriching conversation that we could all sort of engage with through our material culture in our collection. I'm going to pass the mic over to, it was going to be Bill, but I think we're going to go to question and answer. So
Yeah,
I think
that's right.
awesome.
Yes, so feel free, those who are viewing the program, to add your comments or questions in the chat or the Q&A feature. We did have one comment from earlier, Andy, that one of our members says that when I was a teen back in the early 1960s, we put SWAK on all our envelopes. So you are correct that it was sealed with a kiss.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what the common one these days is. I don't know one that is as sentimental as sealed with a kiss. I know TTYL was big when I was a teenager. That was taught to me later. Well, we'll give people just a couple minutes to add any questions that you might have. I will open up to any of the curators. What was one object that you didn't get to talk about today that you might talk about in a future program? I guess, Andy, you're unmuted, so if you've got one.
Oh, okay. Well, I will say that sort of in line with Karen's quilt square, but not on the same theme, we did get in a fairly remarkable award-winning quilt that commemorated the bicentennial of the victory at Yorktown. So it's a very large quilt. It was all handmade, represented every one of the 50 states. It was featured in an issue of National Geographic, one at the state fair level, a number of, at the state fair level. So we're really looking forward to, at some point, since we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the war, maybe displaying that piece.
That would be really cool. Well, we've got another question here. So you all have talked about lots of different objects and letters and manuscripts that we have in our collection. Question for our members and for the public is, can people come and see those objects in person? And if so, what's the process for doing that?
Well, I guess since I'm unmuted. So some of the items, that you've seen today may someday go on public exhibition, so you may see them there. I think all of the pieces that we talked about today, we don't have an immediate plan for them to go on exhibition when we reopen, with all of our exhibitions next year. If someone specifically wanted to come in and see an object, they would they can contact me. But there's also a form online that they can fill out to make an appointment to see an object. Right now, we're, because of the general chaos of construction, we have limited appointments available, but you know, people can always come in and see objects by appointment. It's a little bit easier to see diaries, manuscripts, newspapers, maps through our reading room. And that's by appointment only right now as well.
Yes, and those forms that Andy mentioned, for those watching, they are accessible on our website. So if you go to our website and you go to the collections tab, and same thing for visiting our library as well. So we do have a question here. So on the quilt, was the ribbon stitched over something? Do we know what is beneath it? I'm wondering if the ribbon was added after the piece was made, specifically to display the ribbon. So question for Karen.
Thanks, that's a great question. And actually the ribbon was fully integrated into the quilt. So it's stitched directly to its adjacent pieces. And then like a typical quilt, there's batting and then the, the base fabric. So it was not added later. We don't know a lot about the provenance of the quilt. The donor received it as a gift from a friend who purchased it at an auction, at a dealer in Charleston, South Carolina. So we don't really know the origin of the quilt, who made it, but from, looking at the material evidence of the piece, we do know that that ribbon was stitched right in. So I imagine it was made by a woman whose maybe husband was a member of the APA, or she herself could have been part of a female auxiliary of the APA, both versions of the APA. They were male only, but they did have female auxiliary groups. Thanks for that question.
Yeah. All right, well, I do want to honor everyone's time. So thank you all so much for tuning in today. And I think Andy wanted to do one more remark before we sign off.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's really been great being with my colleagues this morning and with all of you. I have to say that this is, it's with so many mixed emotions that I have to say that this is going to be Bill Rasmussen's last curator conversation because Bill is retiring at the end of the year. And a much deserved retirement. Bill has played a very long an important role in building our reputation as one of the finest historical institutions in the nation. He's worked here for 30 years. Not only did his expertise serve all of us and you well, but his enthusiasm and kindness have really helped him develop close relationships with many of our donors and our members. And I'm sure maybe some of you have had encounters with Bill, and I would imagine you remember them fondly. Bill's first exhibit here was The Making of Virginia Architecture. It opened in 1992. And since then, he's organized more than 14 exhibitions, some of which have traveled nationwide. He was one of the curators who created our current version of the story of Virginia. And he has written 13 or co-authored 13 books that will also live on. He has always enthusiastically and freely shared his extensive knowledge and Virginia history and our collection with me over the I've only been here like half as long as Bill has. And the scholarship that Bill has contributed to our field and his impact on our growth is just really remarkable. And, the 30 years he spent here leaves a lasting legacy that all Virginians will benefit from. So thank you, Bill, for all of your work.
Well, Andy, I thank you very much. That's very, very kind of you to say all that. But you know, with the wonders of the internet now, I can't get away very far. I'm talking to you now from a hotel room in Washington. So you may see me again. Thanks very much.
Well, I hope we do. And we'll next year we'll drag you in. You can talk about, something that you've recently acquired.
Thanks.
Exactly. Bill will be our man on the outside, getting even more stuff donated to us. All right. Well, members, thank you so much for joining us today. Our curators, thank you so much for taking the time to give us just a taste of everything that you've been working on. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are so excited to welcome all of our members and the public back to our fully reimagined VMHC in May when we reopen. There will be lots more news and emails and mailed information going out to you, letting you know what we have going on. And again, a very happy holiday season and a very happy new year. And we will see you all at the museum or hopefully at the next curator conversation. That'll be in February. So take care, everyone, and have a very happy new year. Bye.